All right, today we're putting on our detective hats. We're going to investigate two of the Old Testament's most fascinating cold cases, the books of Obadiah and Joel.
So here's our game plan for this little investigation. First, we'll start with the shortest book in the entire Bible. Then, we're going to unpack a really intense family betrayal that's at the heart of it all. After that, we'll dive into a linguistic puzzle that honestly changes everything. From there, we'll move on to our second case file, and finally, we'll get into why these ancient arguments still matter so much to us today.
Okay, let's open up that first case file. The book of Obadiah is tiny. It's barely a page in most Bibles, but don't let its size fool you. It's hiding a massive story and an even bigger puzzle.
21. That's it. The entire book of Obadiah has just 21 verses. That makes it the shortest book in the Old Testament. And just to give you some perspective, the book of Jeremiah has over 1,300 verses.
So right away, you have to ask, right? What on earth could be so urgent, so important, that it needed its very own book, even if it's this short?
Well, the answer is a pronouncement of divine judgment. And the reason for it all? It goes back to a deep, ancient family feud that has blown up into a full-blown international crisis.
So, the conflict is between Israel and its neighbor, the nation of Edom. But here's the thing, these aren't just any two nations. The text specifically frames them as brother nations because their ancestors were the biblical twins, Jacob and Esau. Now, this context is absolutely crucial because it turns a political conflict into a deeply personal family betrayal.
And Obadiah levels a really serious charge. He says that when foreign invaders came and plundered Jerusalem, Edom didn't just stand by and watch its brother suffer. Nope. It actually participated, gloating over the destruction and even helping the enemy. This betrayal, this is the crime at the very heart of the book.
But this is where the mystery really starts to deepen. See, the case isn't nearly as straightforward as it seems. It all comes down to a tricky linguistic puzzle in the original Hebrew that has had scholars arguing for centuries.
The core of the debate is this. Are we reading a kind of crime report that details what Edom has already done? Or is this more like a stern warning from a prophet, telling them what they should not do in an upcoming disaster?
And get this entire debate hinges on how you translate a single Hebrew verb form. You can translate it in the past tense, you should not have looked, which condemns something that already happened, or you can translate it as a future command, do not look. This one grammatical choice completely changes the meaning and the timeline of the whole book. It's incredible.
And here's why that's a really big deal. If it's a future warning, then the book was probably written before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. That would make it a prophecy that was tragically ignored. But if it's talking about a past event, it was most likely written after that catastrophe as a reflection on it. So yeah, this tiny linguistic puzzle is actually one of our biggest clues for dating the entire book.
But the puzzles don't stop there. Oh no! The book's final prophecy, the one about Israel's restoration and triumph over its enemies, well, that's been interpreted in at least 3 very different ways over the centuries.
So let's break down the 3 main lenses that scholars and theologians use to try and understand these final, really powerful verses. And just know, each one gives us a completely different picture of what the prophecy could mean. Okay, first up is a view called spiritualization. The idea here is that the prophecy isn't about literal armies and land grabs at all. Instead, it's a metaphor. In this reading, when it says Israel will possess the land of its enemies, it's actually a symbol for the New Testament church spreading the gospel into new places, kind of conquering them with a message of faith.
The second way to see it is historical fulfillment. This perspective says, nope, this was literal and it already happened. This view points to Jewish military leaders, like the Maccabees, who actually led armies and reconquered a lot of the specific territory mentioned in the book, including Edom. For these folks, the prophecy is a done deal, case closed.
And then there's the third approach, future fulfillment. This view agrees that the prophecy is literal, but it hasn't happened yet. It points to some future end times event where all the specific land promises and judgments described in Obadiah will finally and completely come to pass.
So Obadiah is one seriously complex case file, just full of these interpretive clues. But he's not the only one. Let's open our second file, the book of Joel. And this one presents a different and maybe even trickier kind of mystery. You see, unlike most prophetic books, it gives us no clear date, no king's name. There's just nothing to anchor it in history.
So without any of those obvious historical signposts, scholars have to become detectives again, piecing together these small internal clues from inside the book itself. And, as you can probably imagine, when you're only working with circumstantial evidence, the conclusions are all over the map.
This table does a great job of showing just how tricky this detective work gets, because scholars are looking at the exact same clues and coming to completely opposite conclusions. I mean, take the enemy nations. Joel mentions some of Israel's early foes, which points to an early date. But then other verses seem to hint that Israel has already been scattered, which would mean a late date. Or look at the leadership. The fact that there's no king could fit an early period when a young king ruled under a high priest, or it could fit the late period after there was no king at all. It's a classic cold case, you know? It's all about how you interpret the evidence.
So, after all this digging around in grammar and history, you might be wondering, why does any of this really matter? Who cares if Obadiah was written early or late, or if Joel's clues are a bit fuzzy? What is the big picture here? Well, it matters because these little books are like a micro-library of prophecy. One scholar, Paul Robbie, called Obadiah a concise epitome of all the major themes you find in the much bigger, more complicated prophetic books. So when you wrestle with the puzzles in Obadiah and Joel, you're actually getting a crash course in these foundational ideas like the day of the Lord, judgment on the nations, and even Zion theology, this really powerful idea that God's deliverance is tied to Mount Zion in Jerusalem.
So in the end, the goal isn't just about finding one single right answer. It's about appreciating that to read these ancient texts, we have to think like historians and linguists and detectives. The puzzles in Obadiah and Joel actually teach us as much about how we should read as they do about what we're reading. They challenge us to approach all these ancient texts with a little more care, a lot more curiosity, and a much deeper appreciation for the incredible mysteries they hold.